Hello, and so welcome to another session on criticism, and we have the concluding video of lyrical palettes. So let's begin. Next we have the poetic pleasure. Wordsworth refers to Aristotle's view that chief aim of poetry is to afford pleasure, and it is more philosophic than history. He states how they are different. Poetry deals with the universal things, whereas history deals with a particular thing, with a particular incident or a particular thing. He now speaks about poetic pleasure as such. According to Wordsworth, poetic pleasure is not mere idle amusement. Don't think that poetic pleasure is just an amusement. It has more than that. It has a more purpose, worthier purpose than that. It is the basic principle of life. Pleasure is the basic principle of life and nature. The poet, therefore, should give immediate pleasure to his readers, and that is his function. It does not matter whether he deals with real or imaginary characters and situations. This obligation on the part of the poet is indeed an acknowledgement of the beauty of universe, and it is a homage paid to the dignity of man. Pleasure is connected with knowledge because anything that is really interesting might be instructive, right? It gives us pleasure. Even knowledge gives us pleasure. In fact, almost everything that exists in us are those built up by the feelings of pleasure. See, even when we sympathize, there is a sort of pleasure, a subtle pleasure. I know it might sound absurd, but it is true. Even Wordsworth speaks of it. Yes, even a subtle pleasure we experience because when we sympathize, we in our subconscious mind rejoice or even thank the Almighty that we are spared from that calamity. When we see somebody's problems, when we see somebody's when we see someone else's sufferings, there is a pleasure in our mind. I'm not speaking the term as of the same pleasure that you feel the happiness, the pleasure as of happiness. That's different. This is a different pleasure. This is a subtle pleasure, a kind of a sort of a subtle, very slight, subtle pleasure. Why? When we sympathize, in our subconscious mind, it's not happening in our conscious mind, it's in our subconscious mind, we are rejoicing because we are spared from that calamity. We are not the one that was chosen for that worse experience. We thank God that we are not a part of, we are not the victim. So there is a pleasure, that's also a pleasure. Not the kind of pleasure that you think as of happiness, but a sort of pleasure, a feeling, a thankfulness, a gratitude. There's pleasure. So pleasure is a human phenomenon, and it exists in nature also, not just in us, it exists in nature as well. So the chief aim of poetry, according to Wordsworth, is to afford pleasure, and this is more philosophic. Pleasure is philosophic, it is didactic, and we learn from it. So he says that it must not be regarded as a degradation of the poet's art. Giving pleasure cannot be looked upon as a degradation of poet's art. This function can be performed only by one who looks at the world with love. Pleasure is the basic principle of life and nature. Now next he goes on to speak about the superiority of poetry over science. According to him, knowledge brings pleasure to all, be it a poet or a scientist or a mathematician. Remember, in our 10th standards or our 11th and 12th, not 11th and 12th, mostly in 10th and 9th, just imagine you are not very good. I was not very good in maths, so anyway. But when I get a sum right, this is a sort of pleasure and has a lot of happiness that brings to me. When you learn a new thing, a new phenomenon or a new thing, get a new word, especially that's one thing for English students. When you learn a new word and you're able to use it perfectly well, you get a sort of pleasure from it. So knowledge brings pleasure to everybody. For a scientist, when he finds out, does an experiment and it turns out right, and he learns, and he's able to prove a fact, or he's able to prove something, that gives him a pleasure. So is the case of mathematician. For a scientist and mathematician, knowledge is but it is an individual acquisition. It is not something for everyone. It's his individual acquisition. But for a poet, it is necessary. It is a part of his existence. That is, according to Wordsworth, the truth of science are particular and individual, whereas poetic truth, on the other hand, for a poet, it is universal. The pleasure that he gives upon knowledge, the knowledge that he gives, the philosophical ideas, the truth, knowledge that he gives is not something that gives him pleasure alone. It is not an individual thing. It is not a particular thing, but rather it is universal. See, for a scientist and a mathematician, when he gives it to the world, it is useful to the world. But the knowledge that he gets, that he experiences, is not shared by the world. It is only the useful things, or his experiment and his useful or his inventions that make our world easier. Yes, we enjoy that, but the knowledge that he gets, or the happiness that he gets upon his success, is his own. It is individual. Whereas for a poet, for poetry, on the other hand, it is not like that. When a poet writes something, we directly experience the same joy, the same truth, the same feeling, the same pleasure that the poet also experiences. Right? So poetry is universal. The poetic truth is universal. Okay? The scientist seeks truth as a remote and unknown benefactor. For him, truth is an unknown benefactor. Whereas a poet rejoices in the presence of truth as our visible friend that we can see. An hourly companion who always helps him to write something that benefits the world. Abstract qualities are personified here. They are companions as we can communicate. Whereas for a scientist, it is an unknown, remote, hidden benefactor. Okay? So here it means that the scientist acquires only a superficial knowledge, but the poet unravels the inner reality as he goes down to the soul of things, the very soul. He brings out the human nature. He is the one who has understood human world or human nature. That's why I always tell you, being an English student, you should be proud of yourself, because you as a poet, you as a literature student is able to understand human life, human nature. You get to the depth of the human soul. You are able to make out a person, whether he's a good man or a bad man, because you come across truth, you come across poetic truth, you come across various characters in the novels and plays and drama. You see the rise and fall of man, you see the good and bad. Even the subtle smirk on a person's face. ഒരു പുച്ഛ ചിരി ഉണ്ടല്ലോ, അതുവരെ നിങ്ങൾക്ക്, അതിൻ്റെ അർത്ഥം വരെ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് കണ്ടുപിടിക്കാൻ പറ്റും. എന്തുകൊണ്ടാണ്? നിങ്ങളൊരു ലിറ്ററേച്ചർ സ്റ്റുഡൻ്റ് ആയതുകൊണ്ടും നിങ്ങളിത് ഈ കഥാപാത്രങ്ങളെല്ലാം വായിക്കുകയാണ്. അവരുടെ ഓരോ ഫീലിങ്സും അനലൈസ് ചെയ്യുന്നുണ്ട്, ക്രിട്ടിക്കലി അനലൈസ് ചെയ്യുന്നുണ്ട്. അതുകൊണ്ട് ബി പ്രൗഡ് of being an English student. I know many a times I keep saying this to you. It's not because I feel negative. It's not in the negative sense, because many a times when you keep repeating, psychologically you would say that, okay, when you keep repeating something, you also feel the same. No, it's not that. It is because right now it has come to that level. Okay, it is you. Yourself had felt the same when you came the first year. We didn't get an admission in commerce, and so we came here. As though there is no use in studying literature. So we are just trying to tell you that it's not like that. Literature is a world where you become more humane. The passion, you understand life. You become a better human being. It may not bring you a lot of wealth as of the other people around you, but depends on how you use your knowledge. It may not give you, it may not promise you a very peaceful, happy life, but it will definitely promise you that you would become a good person, a good human being. Okay, but you will have to love literature for that. You'll have to get into the soul of things. Okay, so much for the chit chat. Let's come back. Okay, that's the appeal of the scientist. So the scientist, the knowledge that he acquires is very superficial, whereas for a poet, he gets to the inner reality. He gets down to the soul of things and he brings out the reality. And scientists can only എത്ര പോയാലും ഒരു സൂപ്പർഫിഷ്യൽ ആയിട്ടുള്ള നോളജ് മാത്രമേ കിട്ടുന്നുള്ളൂ. ഒരുപാട് കാര്യങ്ങൾക്ക് സയൻസിന് പോലും ഉത്തരവില്ല. വേറെ ഫിലോസഫിക്ക് ഒരുപാട് കാര്യങ്ങൾ, ആബ്സ്ട്രാക്റ്റായിട്ടുള്ള എത്രയോ കാര്യങ്ങൾക്കൊരു റീസൺ തരാൻ പറ്റുന്നു അല്ലേ. നമ്മുടെ ബുദ്ധിസ്റ്റ് ഫിലോസഫീസ് ആയാലും, ക്രിസ്ത്യൻ ഫിലോസഫീസ് ആയാലും, ഹിന്ദു ഫിലോസഫീസ് ആയാലും, ഇസ്ലാം ഫിലോസഫീസ് ആയാലും, they are able to give you a lot of truth, a lot of things that you can understand, because it is getting down to the philosophical matter of the soul. But science cannot. Mathematics or science or history cannot. Whereas philosophy, not philosophy, even philosophyയിൽ പോലും ഒരു ഫിലോസഫിയും പോയട്രിയും വ്യത്യാസമുണ്ട് കേട്ടോ. ഫിലോസഫി ഈ പോയട്രിയിൽ നിന്നാണ്. ശരിക്കും പറഞ്ഞു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ പോയട്രി ഈസ് ദ ഓൾഡസ്റ്റ് ഫോം ഓഫ് നോളജ്. ഈ പോയട്രിയിൽ നിന്നാണ് ബാക്കിയുള്ള, പോയട്രിയാണ് അമ്മ എങ്കിൽ ഫിലോസഫി ആയാലും ഹിസ്റ്ററി ആയാലും സയൻസ് ആയാലും ഇതെല്ലാം പോയട്രിയുടെ കുഞ്ഞുങ്ങൾ എന്ന് വേണമെങ്കിൽ പറയാം. അപ്പോൾ philosophical poetry is full of philosophy and truth. Okay, so therefore it gets to the inner reality and it's able to go down to the soul of things and can give you answers to questions that that science cannot give, that history cannot interpret, or mathematics cannot solve. Thus, the appeal of the scientist is only to the intellect, whereas the poet it goes straight to the heart and soul of the readers. Okay, so poetry, according to Wordsworth, is the breadth and finer spirit of all knowledge. As a poet, he is a man of greater sensibility. The truth he discovers is charged with feelings and emotions. The scientist is just a helper or a benefactor to mankind and seeks to bind all mankind with the ties of mutual love and affection. A time may come, but when science will revolutionize the material conditions of human life. That is what is happening now. See how far-sighted Wordsworth was. At that time also poetry will play an important role. The poet will impart, perfect the truth discovered by the scientists. He will impart life and substance, flesh and blood to the dry bones of science. So what happened during the pandemic? Why is it that we all took books to read? Some of us bought pets to, to overcome that insecurity and loneliness, right? And what is happening in the online class? We are surrounded by technology, we are surrounded by science. The normal life has been suspended. And what now plays? We are watching movies, the past, the old movies. We have downloaded old movies, we have downloaded literature, great works of literature. Many of us started poetry groups. So what happens here is literature is playing a very important role, and science, as Wordsworth said, see how far-sighted Wordsworth was. There will be a time when science will revolutionize the material conditions of human life. And that too, it was a period when science was beginning to, the industrial revolution, when science was beginning to take over. And 200 years from then, you have the same words, exact, whatever Wordsworth felt would happen has happened. And literature now plays an important role in giving solace to people. So he says, poetry will impart life and substance, flesh and blood to the dry bones of science. The pleasure of science are shared by few people, while the pleasure of poetry, on the other hand, is open to all. Again, the truth of science is subject to change. It can change, right? While poetry does not suffer from such threat. Okay, it is constant. There are various interpretations to poetry, a poem. Whereas to science, you have to bring in the correct fact. There could be many misconceptions. If one thing goes wrong, everything goes wrong. For poetry, on the other hand, it is multiple interpretation, and therefore poetry does not suffer from such threat. Next is poetic diction. Wordsworth justifies and emphasizes his view once again that poetry is something noble and sublime, very high standard, and should not be spoiled by use of stylistic devices such as poetic diction. We discussed that in the last video. If any poet uses such artificial devices, it suggests that his subject is trivial, very silly, and he's trying to make up or make ornate his very silly theme. He tries to win admiration through artificial means, as I said, just like the makeup, for instance. He justifies the use of meter and he condemns the use of poetic diction. So according to him, meter is what makes poetry different from that of prose, and that's it. And he does not like the use of too much of poetic diction. Meter is something regular and uniform, while poetic diction is arbitrary and capricious. The rules of meter are fixed and it is traditional too. Meter does not interfere with passion, but diction, vocabulary, words is not like that. It will affect the poet. It will affect the poem. Personification, similes, abstract truths, symbols can bring about misjudgments, whereas meter does not. Meter has a restraining and tempering effect on the flow of emotion and passion. That is, it softens the painful and pathetic. Meter has a distancing effect. It imparts grace and dignity to the lighter emotions and provide an element of contrast and perception of similarity in dissimilarity. Sometimes the words of the poet may be inadequate to raise the reader to the desired level of excitement. In that case, only thing that can actually do it, impart passion, is meter. It increases emotional density. The music of harmonious metrical language can give pleasure without poetic diction. You don't have to use flamboyant phraseology, or you don't have to use big words or dictions and abstract ideas and personifications and metaphors. All you need is the metrical language, meter, rhythm. Description of passion or characters in verse, that is poetry, will give much delight than in prose. So the difference that lies in poetry and prose is that of meter. See, the neoclassical writers were also for meter, they also implemented meter, they also had meter, but according to them, they also stated the same thing, that there is or there should be a difference in poetry and prose. There is a difference in poetry and prose, but the neoclassicists, to them, they created the difference between poetry and prose by using flamboyant phraseology or poetic diction. Whereas Wordsworth states that that is not needed. Poetic diction is not needed. It is poetic meter which is needed. Okay? And then he goes on to elaborate his very famous definition of poetry. He says, poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. Emotion is contemplated till tranquility, or the emotion is contemplated till tranquility gradually disappears, and an emotion similar to the original emotion is produced some time later. It is in this mood, in this successful composition or it is in this mood that a successful composition generally begins. At this time, the mind of the poet will be in a state of enjoyment. He doesn't rewrite it at that moment. He takes it, he keeps it, he contemplates it till tranquility is attained. And slowly, once the tranquility begins to disappear, an emotion very similar to that particular emotion, the original emotion that the poet had upon seeing a particular scene or that feeling, whatever the feeling was, that original emotion which is similar to it comes up, that is later, that is produced, it is then that he writes the poem. So you are familiar with Daffodils, the poem by Wordsworth. So I can perhaps tell you a little bit about Daffodils to understand this theory of Wordsworth. See, when William Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy Wordsworth visited Glencoyne Park in 15 April 1802, the visit gave Wordsworth the inspiration to write his most famous poem, Daffodils. Now, they passed the strip of land at Glencoyne Bay in Ullswater. Ullswater is actually the second largest lake in the Lake District. It covers about 3/4 mile wide and has a maximum depth of 200 feet at Houghton. And the lake has three distinct bends, giving it a dog-leg appearance. Okay, so that's it for the anecdote. When he saw this, a host of beautiful daffodils in or next to this, and there is an interesting, very interesting journal also by Dorothy, which says, when we were in the woods beyond Go Barrow Park, we saw a few daffodils close to the waterside. We fancied that the lake had floated the seed ashore and that the little colony had so sprung up. But as we went along, there were more and more, and at last, under the boughs of the tree, we saw that there was a long belt of them along the shore, about the breadth of a country turnpike road. I never saw daffodils so beautiful. They grew among the mossy stones about and about them. Some rested their heads upon these stones as on a pillow for weariness, and the rest tossed and reeled and danced and seemed as if they verily laughed with the wind that blew upon them over the lake. They looked so gay, ever dancing, ever changing. This wind blew directly over the lake to them. There was here and there a little note and a few stragglers a few yards higher up, but they were so few as not to disturb the simplicity and unity and of life. So yeah, that's it. So from this, if you look at the poem of Wordsworth, Daffodils of Wordsworth, you will find whatever Dorothy had spoken of the daffodils is spoken by Wordsworth, right? I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way. They stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them dance, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not be but gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft, when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. So this is the poem. So I just told you this poem to tell you about the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotion. So according to Wordsworth, poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. So it's not about Wordsworth was inspired to write poem or inspired to write his daffodils when he saw this in the Lake District, that park there, but he did not write it at that time. He contemplated over it till tranquility gradually disappeared, and an emotion very similar to the original emotion that he got upon that visit came back to him later. And when in that mood, in this pensive mood, is when he successfully composed the poem, successfully wrote the poem. So at this time, the mind of the poet will be in a state of enjoyment because he voluntarily describes any passion that arises in him. But this passion he communicates to the reader must be accompanied by pleasure. So that's why he says of this poetic pleasure, the poetic diction. No, sorry, the meter, not the poetic diction, meter. He says that he may be criticized for the treatment of very ordinary incidents, looking at the daffodils, being filled and overjoyed by the sight of a host, thousands of daffodils standing, fluttering and dancing in the breeze, brought him a lot of joy. So he says that he may be criticized for the treatment of ordinary incidents or situations in very unconventional language. He cautions, however, his readers against a mode of false criticism of poetry in which language closely resembles that of ordinary people. He takes the example of Samuel Johnson's ballads, Babes in the Wood, which is actually a parody of the ballad stanza Babes in Wood, or better known as Children in the Wood, by Thomas Percy, published by Thomas Percy. In both these stanzas, the language is no different from the ordinary language. It is communicated in very normal, ordinary speech and not words which are ornated to make it rich. But Wordsworth disagrees only with one thing. He is okay with the language that he has used. He has used the normal, ordinary language. But the theme that Johnson took was what made it despicable, terrible. The triviality of theme using the old, it's a parody. Samuel Johnson, a neoclassicist, used it as a parody. So he says that Johnson used such an old ancient ballad, especially the meter in the old ancient ballad was used to satirize or for a very trivial, very silly thing. That is not right. Wordsworth goes on to say that some of the colloquial and ordinary words used by him may have been found ludicrous to others, may have been found foolish to others. But this is because many of the readers are not aware of the changes in various stages of meanings. English language having a lot of change, the variation, the evolution. There's a lot of change in the meaning itself through which words have passed by. We're still in that conventional mood. The appreciation of poetry is a talent acquired by thought and long contact with the best models of composition. Hence, he tells his readers, please do not make hasty judgment of poetical works. It can lead to a false judgment. He concludes by telling his readers that in order to enjoy the poems in lyrical ballads, they should give up what is ordinary or what is otherwise enjoyed, the neoclassical poems. And he requests them to judge poems by their own feelings and not go about by the opinions of the critics. And thus we end the lyrical ballads. Okay, so it's about poetic diction. He advocates the use of meter. He's against the use of unwanted poetic diction. Okay, and he says that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and it takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. And this emotion is contemplated, and when once tranquility gradually disappears, an emotion similar to the original emotion, it's in the pensive mood, it is produced some time later. Okay, and it is in this mood that a successful composition generally begins, a successful composition of a poem. So he says that he does not care about the treatment of ordinary situations and incidents. He may have used ordinary incidents and situations and he's being criticized, and he points out to Samuel Johnson, what about him? He has used a very old ancient ballad, and that too that metrical form, to satirize, to make fun of, and he takes the babes in wood. It's a parody. He takes a very trivial, very silly incident. That is what makes it despicable, terrible. Okay. And he tells his readers, he also reminds his readers, he concludes by reminding his readers once again that they are to judge poems according to their own feelings and not by the opinions of the critics. Okay. It is appreciating poetry is a talent. It is a talent, and it is normally acquired by thought and long contact with the best musical or best models of composition. That is, you should have an understanding of poetry. You should have an understanding of all the types of poems, both ancient and modern. All right, and you should also be aware of the various changes happening in language, the meanings beginning to change. You have to have a thorough understanding of that also. Only then you can appreciate a change. Otherwise you will be traditional, you will sit with that particular conventional style and will not be open to new ideas and new methods. So with that we come to the end of the lyrical palettes. Thank you for listening and have a nice day.